Hello, I'm Martha Minow, and it is with great delight that I welcome you to the Frances Biddle Lecture of 2016. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the lecture, a little bit about our lecturer, and then I'm going to get off the stage so you can actually be able to hear why you're here. So there was a man, the Attorney General of the United States, whose name was Frances Biddle. He served under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was also a member of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. And when he passed away, his wife established a fund to support a series of lectures to be given at the Harvard Law School. And she said, without limiting the subject matter, I hope that those selecting the individual lectures will keep in mind that civil liberties and civil rights were a particular concern to my husband. And I can actually think of very few people who would better exemplify the values that Frances Biddle and his wife tried to support. Past Biddle lecturers have included William Hastie and Catherine McKinnon and Reva Siegel, and a conference we held in this spirit after 9/11. And so at a time when I think many of us are looking for lessons from history about courage and about dealing with challenging times, I am so very, very thrilled that we have Professor David Blight here and that he's going to talk about Frederick Douglass. So Professor Blight is the class of 1954 professor of American history at Yale University. His magnificent and important books include American Oracle, The Civil War in the Civil Rights Era, which received many, many prizes, but more importantly, is something you should actually read if you haven't done so, because it really helped to launch and propel an understanding of memory as a critical aspect of our history and how we construct our present and future. Another one of his really magnificent books is A Slave No More, Two Men Who Escaped to Freedom, including their narratives of emancipation, which includes two slave narratives that had recently been discovered and brought them to attention. And one more, Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory. More book prizes than I can name, and a book that I reread every year. So yes, so it is with tremendous delight and honor that I turn the podium over now to Professor David Blight.
Thank you, Dean Minow. I can't name too many books I read every year. I'll try to believe that. I really will. I mean, and I wish my mother could have heard that. And thank you to Tomiko Brown-Nagin for inviting me for this. I take it the mic is on because I'm hearing it loud. All right? Okay, great. Let's get right at it. There may be a Trump supporter or two here, I doubt it. Coming through Harvard Square, I tried to see somebody with a smile on their face. I saw one woman on a bus bench on her cell phone smiling. It was probably a call from her daughter who hadn't called in 2 months or something. It's just, I don't know. What is this? Is this a low-grade 9/11? What is this? I just read a piece a friend just sent me. I read it on my phone by Frank Rich, pretty smart guy. He says we're in for a low-grade civil war. Who knows? The hyperbole will flow for days, or not hyperbole. I had thought of trying to make this talk about that famous speech Douglass gave in Glasgow on the Constitution in 1860, which I know almost everybody reads in law schools, but I'm not. You've read that. You know that he has his own tortured view of the anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution, and you probably know why by then, that he so needed it by 1860 and had adopted it at least 8 years earlier, and his break with Garrison, et cetera. You know all of that. I'm going to try to focus here on how Douglass coped with great betrayals, great crises, great defeats in the wake of victory. He had many of these, and I'm going to say a few things about a few of them. I don't know yet what this election tells us about our education. You know, we're going to have to figure that out. Hello, Jim. What does it tell us about racism in America that is always laying around out there, ready to be scooped up somehow? What does it tell us about gender? What does it tell us about the failure of institutions? I don't know. I'm reminded, though, of, and I won't go into it, but when my book Raisin Reunion came out, it had just come out, and the first book event I had scheduled, this was in September of '01, was at the Morgan Library about 7 or 8 days after 9/11. It had been scheduled for months. And man, the Morgan Library, wow, I was having my book launch. And at first they decided to cancel it, like everything else. And then they said, no, New Yorkers need to go to something, or maybe they will. And so they held it. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I can't just talk about my book. What do I do? And I remember I went back to Henry May's old book, The End of American Innocence, and other works about innocence. I mean, because in the press already, within the first week after 9/11, was America now going to lose its innocence? Yes, no, what is innocence? What do we mean when we say that? So I went back and tried, I gave the audience what you probably didn't want, which was about 15 minutes of about 4 episodes in American history where we had lost our innocence and regained it. I won't go into that today either, although I did finally publish that somewhere. Had it always laying around in handwritten notes. And I don't know if what's happened with this election is the opposite somehow, or not. I don't know. Douglass, I'm assuming a lot here about what you know about Frederick Douglass, which is wonderful, because with some public audiences, you can't do that. There's a guy on the train right across from me, coming up here. What are you working on? A talk I have to give. Where? Harvard. What's it on? Frederick Douglass. Oh, what would he have thought of yesterday's election? You know. I could have said, come to the lecture at the Harvard Law School. In the wake of the Dred Scott case, a terrible moment in Douglass's history, arguably, I still argue with my students, the single most important turning point of the 1850s. I mean, after Dred Scott, I don't think there's any middle left. Moderation was ruined. Disunion may not have utterly been inevitable, and war certainly wasn't inevitable, but Dred Scott's an enormous turning point. Douglass gives this amazing speech right after the decision where he tried to do what he always did, which was to fashion hope out of despair and so on. That was really part of his mojo and had been throughout the 1850s. But then at the end, he simply admits, I do not, and he does it in these beautiful metaphors of looking for that faint grain of hope across the horizons of the hills. And you know, if you've read Douglass, you know what he would do with these metaphors of hills and horizons. But then he said, I do not know where hope is. I walk by faith, not by sight. Now he used that phrase a lot. That's from Corinthians, where Douglass almost always went when he needed some wisdom, some way of finding meaning in a moment or in a great event, was the Bible. And no apologies for that. It may not be where some of us go or some of you go. But one of the primary arguments of this new biography I'm about to finish, I'm on chapter 31, which is the last chapter. But there's going to be an epilogue on the death and funeral. But anyway, more on the biography just briefly in a moment. But and one of the primary arguments of the book that many Douglass biographers have not stressed as much, certainly some have, is just a deeply grounded, deeply rooted Douglass was, particularly in the Old Testament. Not necessarily always as faith, but certainly as his source of meaning, rhetoric, wisdom, language, and story. I'll try to say a little more about that in a moment. Where did Douglass go to try to explain the immediate aftermath of the civil rights cases of 1883? There are many places we could go in between, but that's arguably a Dred Scott of the 1880s. I mean, it's not the end of the turnaround of the 14th Amendment, or the destruction of the equal protection, but it's a major turning point, the civil rights cases of '83. And just before this, I mean, Douglass had been the keynote speaker in September of '83. Decision comes out right after that at a major black convention in Louisville, very controversial convention for reasons I won't go into. But it was an amazing convention. These 160 delegates from all over the country, including the South, and they had 11 grievances that were announced and published, and they were about the color line, Jim Crow, lynching, violence, all kinds of issues, including demands for federal aid to education. There's a lot of modern stuff in the demands and grievances of that convention. And man, he turned it into one of his best speeches, one of his top 5 anyway. And these guys were barely off the train, going home to all the cities all over the country when the news came of the civil rights decision. Those 7 cases or so that ended up in U.S. v. Stanley. And here was Douglass again. 4,000 people gather in D.C. in this huge hall, as usual, to hear Douglass try to make sense of it. And he did this all the time in Washington in the last 2 decades or more of his life, whether it was at Metropolitan AME Church or at a hall called Lincoln Hall. Wherever there was a hall, Douglass would hold forth, usually on Sunday afternoons. In that speech, oh my goodness, he said, among the many metaphors he employed was, it is as if Jefferson Davis was resurrected and he took over the United States Capitol. And then he went on and on with that metaphor about how, you know, any guy on a crossroads in South Carolina now has far more power over black people than the federal government ever will have. I mean, he had a way, you know, if you've read Douglass, you know, he had a way of taking us to a metaphor, a layman's metaphor, sometimes metaphors for all time, to explain what was happening. But he ended that speech from the book of John, and it's in other places in the Bible. It was again an attempt to try to keep hope alive, but then he says, our Lazarus is not dead, he only sleeps. And he repeated it, our Lazarus is not dead. Well, if you know your Bible at all, that's one of the most revolutionary, you know, stories among the thousands in the Bible. It's Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Our Lazarus is dead. Is not dead, he only sleeps. Well, and there are many other examples like this. But I want to take you to an election night in his life that I plan to do in a positive and celebratory way, but you can decide how to use it. It's 1864. You know, that in some ways it's, if not the most unusual election in American history, it ranks right there with 1860, doesn't it? It's Lincoln's re-election, and which was never, of course, any foregone conclusion. In fact, during that summer, Lincoln truly himself believed he would be defeated. And in fact, that caused the second meeting between Lincoln and Douglas. Again, if you know your Douglas, that's when Lincoln invites Douglas to the White House in August of '64 to ask Douglas to do something he could hardly believe. And when those guys were eye to eye, God, if I could be there to see them eye to eye, when Lincoln asked Douglas to set up a plan funneling fugitive slaves, as many as possible, out of the South, out of the border states, under Army control before Election Day, because he believes he's going to be defeated. Lincoln's being asked to kind of create a John Brown plan to liberate slaves. And Douglas's essential response to that was, okay. He had no idea how he was going to do this. He did go north and start recruiting agents and so forth and so on, but it didn't happen, of course, because of the fall of Atlanta, Sheridan taking much of the Shenandoah Valley, and so on. But that election, as some of you know, as I always tell my students, it was the most racist, white supremacist election in American history until the next one. Because 1868, I think, actually was even worse. But the Democrats in 1864, running McClellan for president, made Abraham Lincoln into, you know the language, the amalgamationist in chief, Abraham Africanus, Abraham nigger lover, and on and on and on. In fact, the very word miscegenation was coined in the 1864 election. They produced cartoons and all kinds of campaign material. The Republican Party refused to allow Douglas to go on the stump for Lincoln in '64. The Republican Party had tried to pass, this is important to know when you realize how Douglas is going to react to this election. The Republican Party had tried to pass the original 13th, well, the first 13th Amendment, or is it the second? It's really the second, I guess, attempt. But in the winter and spring of '64, they passed the 13th Amendment, ending slavery, through the House, but couldn't get it through the Senate. And now the Republican Party owned that. It was pinned right on their chest. Not only the Emancipation Proclamation, but the constitutional amendment to end slavery is pinned on them. And that's what the Democrats ran against. And it was working. It really was working. And that campaign became so racist that you can hardly even fathom it unless you look at the language being used. Douglas wanted to go campaign. They wouldn't let him. They walked as far as they could from the image of emancipation. Even Seward, the Secretary of State, sort of rhetorically disavowed emancipation in the middle of the campaign. It was, the Republicans were trying to get reelected and not have to be painted with emancipation, even though they are. So it's an embittered, terrible election. If we think we were tense about this one, everything was on the line here for Black Americans, for Northern Union to white Union troops, for the North. The entire meaning and purpose of all that bloodshed, all that war weariness, hundreds of thousands of dead, that's all on the line in this election. And on the night of the election, Douglas is in Rochester where he lived. He voted that day, of course. He owned enough property as a black man in the state of New York to vote. And in the evening after the polls had closed, I found this was in one of these clippings in the scrapbooks I'll say a word about, how sometimes one newspaper clipping can give you a story, if you're a biographer, that, man, you can milk it for pages, But I got one, and it's this guy who wrote a reminiscence about the night of the 1864 election. He had been a poll worker, and he had been the one that put Frederick Douglass's ballot into the box. Well, later on, you could tell that story and somebody cared. He says that night he was walking back into town with Douglas. Douglas lived about a mile and a half, 2 miles from the center of town. And he says 4 or 5 drunken white thugs come out in the street and they challenged Douglas. They called him the N-word, they challenged him. And according to this observer, Douglas took him on. Or at least said, in effect, come on, you guys want something? You want this? And he says, Douglas just put up his fist and he was ready to take these drunks on. And the observer said these guys just walked off into the alleys and didn't want to mess with Frederick Douglass. And then the guy goes on to editorialize how that night Douglass had gained power with his vote, power with his voice, power with his fists. It's a quote you couldn't make up. But in the wake of the election, Douglas did what he always did in Rochester. That Sunday, he went to Spring Street AME Church. He spoke there all the time, many, many times, a black church in Rochester. And how does he open the speech? The meaning of this election, re-election of Lincoln, and now the possibility that emancipation could be completed. No one knows precisely how and when. He opens with the story of Noah's Ark. Where does Douglas go to try to explain to an audience what that election meant? He went to the oldest rebirth story in the Western world, Noah and the Ark. And he tells the story of Noah sending out the dove to see what would happen. And the dove came back with a twig in its mouth, meaning something was growing again. And then he sends the dove, and then Noah sends the dove out again, and the dove doesn't come back. And so Noah takes the covering off the ark and sees the green land. And I'm just paraphrasing, but Douglas works that into a new world being born. We always talk about the Civil War as a revolution now. We always talk about the rebirth, Lincoln's famous metaphor in the Gettysburg Address, which Douglas had used over and over and over himself in his own famous speech called Mission of the War. But Douglass went to the oldest rebirth tale he could find to explain what this meant. Then, a week later, this may seem painful now after yesterday, but a week later, he went somewhere even far more special. He went to Baltimore for the first time ever since he had escaped from slavery in 1838. He hadn't been back to Baltimore. And he went back because the state of Maryland had just held a referendum to declare itself a free state. And that referendum was won by something like, I don't know, 700 votes. It was like 20-some thousand to 20-some thousand. It barely won. Maryland had just become a free state. So Douglass decided, I'm going to go to Baltimore. He goes to Baltimore, and he was to speak in the Bethel AME Church, which is probably the church, I don't know for sure, probably the church where he met Anna Murray, his first wife. It may have been the church, although there were several in Baltimore where he first worshiped or first experienced, safe, organized religion. But before this speech happened, meeting him at the door to this packed place was his older sister named Eliza, whom we hadn't seen since 1836, Eliza Mitchell. She had gained her freedom. She had purchased her freedom. She and her husband had purchased their freedom about 8 or 10 years after Douglass escaped from the Eastern Shore in 1838. She never became literate, but she knew a lot about her famous brother and had named one of her daughters after Douglass. Her middle name was Douglass. She meets him at the door. He didn't know this was going to happen. And it was the first of many reunions he would have with siblings, cousins, fictive siblings who would claim him. Douglass's extended family became huge and very extended in the last third of his life. He walked into that church arm in arm with his former slave sister, whom he hardly knew, the meeting in some ways of the still peasantry of the Eastern Shore with this world-class intellectual, and there they marched up to the front. What does he do again for trying to find a piece of meaning for his audience now, which is a mostly black audience in Baltimore? Noah's Ark. But what does he do this time? Tells the same story. Noah lets the dove go out. Dove comes back. Dove has a twig, takes the ark off. But he says the real story today is I am the dove. That I am here is the story. Now that sounds pretty pretentious and self-serving, and Douglass could be very pretentious and self-serving most of the time. But in a sense, he was right. The fact that I'm here, he says, I am the dove. And then he works that into an elaborate speech. Elections matter, as though we didn't know. Okay, why am I doing, the title of this talk, by the way, is Douglass, Douglass with exclamation marks, why Douglass, why now? Let me get both of that out of the way in a hurry. I'm playing around with book titles, and I apologize. I just gave a 3-part lecture series in Madison, Wisconsin 2 weeks ago, and I tried different titles there, and all my titles are kind of getting vetoed. But Douglass might be one title, but I'm not so sure anymore. It happened all the time. Douglass would go walk on a platform with other abolitionists. Audiences would start slowly chanting, Douglass, Douglass, Douglass. They often did it in the presence of William Lloyd Garrison, which became a problem. Later in life, he would just walk down the street. People would do the Douglass, Douglass. And the reason we know is he often had reporters just following him around. If he rode in a carriage, excuse me. I didn't sleep enough either, so that's a Freudian slip I'm not responsible for. But when he would ride in a carriage in a parade or a festival as the order of the day or something, audiences would start chanting, Douglass, Douglass. And he was so visible, the white mane of hair. He may have been one of the most recognizable Americans of a whole 19th century because of this image. And because, as we now know from the great work of John Stauffer here, my old friend John here at Harvard, and Zoe Trott and others, he was the most photographed American of the 19th century, just beating out Custer and Mark Twain. They stopped counting Mark Twain's photos in 1900, so it's a little, but who cares? Douglass, the most photographed 19th century American. There are reasons for that that make good sense. But I don't think that's going to be the title. Get that out of the way. Why am I doing this biography? The principal reason is, and there are a lot of good books on Douglass. There's Bill McFeely's full biography back in 1990, which is still a good book. Very good book, actually, although Bill had almost no interest in religion, which is an interesting thing. I'm doing it because I encountered a private collection of Douglass material about 6-7 years ago in Savannah, Georgia. It's one of those things that can happen to historians if you're just blindly lucky. I went to Savannah to give yet another talk on Douglass's narrative to high school and junior high school teachers. The host was the Georgia Historical Society. The gentleman said, there's a local guy here, he's a collector, he's going to come to lunch with us, is that okay? I said, sure. And at lunch, I meet this phenomenal man named Walter Evans. Some of you may know Walter by now, who said after lunch, come on over to the house. He owns one of those gorgeous 4-story or 5-story brownstones in Savannah on Jones Street. If you know Savannah, you know the neighborhood probably. He's an African-American retired surgeon, grew up in Savannah, in segregated Savannah, but was educated in the North and med school at Michigan, practiced as a surgeon in Detroit for 30-some years, which gave us a lot in common. I'm from Michigan, and he had Tiger season tickets, which I never did. So. And what Walter got out that first day, and I'm making a long story short, was his Douglass collection, which almost no one had ever used. And in that collection, among other things, were 10 huge family scrapbooks kept by his sons and his daughter over the last 30, 35 years of their father's life. Huge scrapbooks full of thousands of newspaper clippings, which you really could not find even with ProQuest today. And lots of family material, family letters, marriage certificates, et cetera, including a handwritten memoir by one of his sons about growing up as Douglass's son, about a 15-page piece, and a host of other sorts of things that are in those scrapbooks, photographs, et cetera. And it was one of those moments when I was not intending to I've worked on Douglass in some way all my life, and I've tried very hard to get him out of my life. And then I see this stuff, and I think, oh no. If I don't do this, somebody else will. And so that's really, and I'm going to dedicate the book to Walter and Linda, because I have spent now 4 or 5 spring breaks just working on their dining room table. I mean, that's better than the Houghton Reading Room or the Beinecke Reading Room or any other reading room I've ever been in. They just open the door at 8, coffee's on. Walter, by the way, is also, he owns probably the finest private collection of African-American art anywhere. He's incredible. He's the executor of Jacob Lawrence's estate, and his manuscript and rare book collection is phenomenal, and it should not be in his house. And so don't tell anybody at the Houghton Library or anywhere else here, because we're really working him hard to sell it to well, he's already had an amazing offer to sell all the Douglass stuff from the Beinecke Library at Yale, but he thinks it's worth more than they've offered, which is Walter. He probably will win this one. That's my, what have I learned from all that stuff? Very quickly. It opens up the last third of Douglass's life as never before. You know, most of us know Douglass because of the narrative, the second autobiography, which is really his long-form masterpiece. Douglass is so famous because of overcoming slavery. You know, being a slave and becoming free is in some ways more dramatic than being free. You know, the last third of his life, there's a lot written about it. But we get a Douglass who is often deemed out of touch. He's getting old. He's always in these rivalries and fights with other black leaders, and he was. Oh, if you think black leaders today struggle with each other, and these guys had no real institutions to fight it out in, except the church, and that didn't contain most of them. He had horrible rivalries with people like Richard T. Greener, the first black Harvard graduate, like T. Thomas Fortune came later, but others. Anyway, but that last third of his life has, for me, become the most fascinating of all. It's the aging man, the old man, the man of fame and celebrity. And he may have coped with fame and celebrity about as much as almost any other American, except P.T. Barnum, and he invented the idea, and Twain, who reinvented the idea. But Douglass had something to do with inventing that idea, too. It opens up his extended family, which, if you're a biographer, you don't have any choice. You got to go there. Not only into his two marriages and his two extraordinary and complicated relationships with two European women, one Julia Griffiths Crofts, the English woman who spent six years with him as his assistant editor, and frankly his professional savior on his newspaper in the late 40s and early 1850s, but then Ottilia Assing, the German woman with whom he had about a 22-year relationship, very complex. And by the way, on that relationship, I decided not to rely on my friend Maria Diedrich's fine book about Assing and Douglass called Love Across Color Lines. It is a fine book, but it is inventive. And so I hired a law student at Yale, a German woman, brilliant young woman. I found her through a colleague at the Yale Law School, and asked her if she'd translate almost 300 of Assing's letters from that old German script, and she did. And she did an amazing job for me and for Lee Faught, who is about to publish a book on Douglass and women. And without having these letters on my own in English, I could not have understood the story. And I now, I'm not sure who will ever be absolutely correct about Douglass's long relationship with Ottilia Assing, but it was a terribly important part of his life. And most of what we know about it, about 98% of what we know about it, are in Ottilia Assing's letters. But that last third of Douglass's life opened to me in these scrapbooks and the other parts of the Evans collection in just a host of ways. I can even track him on lecture tours now. If he goes on a lecture tour, there's a clipping up from about every town he appeared in. Now, do you need every one of those? From Kokomo? No. Do I need to know that he spoke in the ice rink in Kokomo? No. But as a biographer, you know this, or historians, texture, we love it. And I get thousands of pieces of texture from those kinds of sources. One quick example. I'm sitting there one day at Walter's dining room table. He comes by. He says, "So what are you finding today?" He knows what he has, but he hasn't seen everything in it. I said, "Walter, did you realize Douglass spoke in Savannah?" He says, No, he never spoke here. I said, "There's a clipping from Savannah." Now, we'd always known Douglass made a few tours into the Deep South after the Civil War, and he did. He went to New Orleans. He made actually several. He went to Tuskegee to speak in 1892 at Booker T. Washington's commencement. But he did other Southern tours. He did one starting in Charleston through Georgia to get to Jacksonville, Florida, to be the keynote orator of the day at Jacksonville's version of a World's Fair. And there it is, clippings that chart the whole tour. And I said, and then Walter says, "Jacksonville?" I said, yeah, Jacksonville. He says, "Oh, well, that explains how James Weldon Johnson saw Douglass when he was a teenager." I said, "What?" Goes to the shelf, pulls off his original edition of Along That Way, Weldon Johnson's autobiography, which I think I had read at least once, but there's a page where he describes being 13, I think, in 1888 or was it 87, I forget the year. The day I saw Douglass, So it's just this kind of stuff that just keeps appearing if you sit there long enough, going through these scrapbooks which can't be photocopied, because they're just not. They just can't be photocopied. All right, I want to wrap up by just trying to give you a sense of the problems one tries to answer or struggle with in a biography of a person, a character as complex and as long-living as Douglass. He doesn't die till 1895. He once divided his own life into 5 parts. It's the very ending, almost the very ending of the first edition of Life and Times, his 3rd autobiography. He said, I had several lives in one, and he gives them categories of time. And they sort of work, his categories, but they're imposed on us. And that's the first problem that anyone working on Douglass faces. It's how the autobiography is always in the way of the biographer. The problem with Douglass is that the subject is always in your way. And you're constantly trying to get around him, through him, over him. Sometimes you just want to sit on him, chain him to a chair, bad metaphor, and say, stop now. Why don't you talk about these 100 subjects in your autobiographies? And he's not, of course, going to talk about his marriages. He doesn't. Attilia Assing gets 1 mention in Life and Times. She's called Miss Assing as part of, she's a family friend. Autobiography is the first problem you face with that. He wrote 1,200 pages of autobiography. It is amazing autobiography, but it is autobiography. And a lot of you've probably read about autobiography or you've worked on it maybe. And yet I've read so much about autobiography now I can't take it anymore. And the debate is always, is it just another form of fiction? What is memoir? My favorite thing I've read, though, recently about memoir, and she's actually mostly convinced me, is Mary Karr. Do you know her work? She wrote The Liars Club. Boy, does she have a distinct voice. Whoa. She's written a book called Lit, and she's written this book now called The Art of Memoir. And she makes a ferocious case in this book for how the best memoirs are about the truth. That the best memoirist is really, really seeking the truth and not manipulating us. Now, I know that sounds like this goes against everything we've learned for 50 years, right? But she makes a compelling case, sort of. But she says this, too. Quote, most memoirists are driven to their projects for their own deeply felt psychological reasons. And she goes on. As Yeats said, Mad Ireland hurt me into poetry. So most of us, she says, have been hurt into memoir. That's been helpful because I've argued, for years now, I've argued that Frederick Douglass was deeply scarred, damaged, if you want. I use all sorts of words for that, by his slave experience. His slave experience was very violent and full of psychological forms of torture. He had a childhood, he said, of extremes. That was his word. He was hurt. Slavery hurt him into autobiography. Do you trust everything he says? Of course not. But it's amazing how his details are mostly accurate. A second thing you face in Douglass that I have, and I kept trying to find a cheaper way to do this, but there is nothing you can do on the cheap if you're doing good work, is this problem of the extended family and the relationships with women, and for that matter, his friendships with men. He did not have many truly close friendships with men. His closest black friend, I think, ever was James McCune Smith, the highly educated, fascinating, brilliant physician, essayist. Douglass was everything Smith wasn't, and Smith was everything Douglass wasn't. And man, were they perfect alter egos. But the extended family has really become a central theme of my biography. The children, his 4 surviving children, with whom he had very messy, complicated relationships. His first wife, Anna, of 44 years, who remained a non-reader all of her life. His second wife, Helen Pitts, a highly educated, quite brilliant woman, 20 years younger, with enormous experience in abolitionism, including catching malaria, working for a year in a contraband camp in the middle of the Civil War. So you can't get around that. And I never fully understood just how complicated his extended family was, including the 21 grandchildren, almost half of whom died in infancy or teenage years. Cedar Hill, Douglass's famous house in Washington, became a site of constant funerals the last 15 years of his life. He never talks about that in Life and Times. You have to find your way into that by other means. It began with his wife's funeral in 1882, where, by the way, the primary black leaders of Washington, D.C. all elbowed each other out of the way to be the pallbearers at Douglass's wife's funeral. And then the next day, most of them went back to attacking him, trying to knock him off his pedestal, so to speak. And Douglass, by the way, loved to be king of the hill. Just try to knock him off. The other, I'll just name these. I just brainstormed this kind of dozen questions or problems. How did a ferocious, radical critic of his own country become a patriot? A defender of its refounding, an advocate even of foreign expansion after that, or imperialist if you want, after that refounding. How does a radical critic become the insider patriot? In fact, that's a major theme in my book, is how does an outsider become an insider, and what kind of insider, and what does that mean, and how does he deal with it, how does he defend it? He becomes a Republican Party functionary, to say the least, with appointed positions in Washington, a major part of that last third of his life. Words. Another major theme of my book, if not the major theme. And in fact, one of the titles I've tried out, which isn't going to work either, is Douglass, the Biography of a Voice. My editor hates that. Too literary, he says. Probably right. I'm probably just going to end up with Frederick Douglass, A Life, like everybody else does. I just hate that kind of thing in biography. But words. Douglass is all about words. He's all about language. And you have to figure out and explain, how does he come by this? How does he find the music of words in his mind? How did he learn to first, how did he learn to use words like this? And that's mysterious. We don't know entirely, although there are some pretty good explanations. But we remember him essentially through words. And words were essentially the only power he ever had, the only weapon he ever had. Words. Everywhere words. The last line in Bondage and Freedom, the second autobiography, is, as long as heaven allows me to work, I will fight this fight with my pen, my voice, and my vote. The vote is there because he's declaring himself a non-Garrisonian now, but it's my pen, my voice, my vote. That's Douglass. Another is fame. It's a hard thing to, how did he come to manage fame or celebrity, especially with this public-private divide in his life? How did he come to do that? How does anybody come to do that? He's an early example of this huge modern problem we live now of celebrity. We just got a celebrity elected as president. God help us. Next, what kind of a revolution was the Civil War, Emancipation, and Reconstruction in American life, and how do you answer it through the life of Douglass? That may be the biggest thing of all. It's kind of what interests people about Douglass. There he sits. And he's born in the 18-teens before there are steamboats. He dies after Edison has made recording devices. He loved modernity, by the way, especially steam power and steamships. But in the middle of his life is this big thing, the Civil War, which meant everything to his own identity, his own meaning. It's at the heart of any attempt to try to explain him. Next, how does an old man learn from the young or fight with them? And as a person getting to be an old man, this is one that he faced all the time. How does he cope with this next generation? How do they cope with him? What is generational leadership for African America in the 19th century. Put another way, one of the problems I've faced is how does an uncompromising radical, and he was, don't make any mistake, he came back from England in 1847, an angry, embittered black man who had just experienced a kind of freedom in England like he never imagined, and he was so bitter and angry in his speech-making that in the press they started calling him the Black Demagogue. And the first time I saw that, of course, that was, ooh, chapter title. But how does somebody who comes to see himself in a kind of prophetic tradition nevertheless become a kind of pragmatic politician inside of power? It's endlessly fascinating, I think, about Douglass. How does he condemn the princes of his own society and their laws, and yet join them and try to influence them? We've seen that story so many times. How do you square covenants with politics? Covenants with politics. That's why Douglass became a proponent of the anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution. He had to have the covenant, even if he had to kind of, misconstrue its meanings at times if you want. If you can come out on that any way you want. He needed that covenant. Without it, what would he do? I'm going to stop with that. I have all kinds of endings I use sometimes about Douglass, but I want to say, Tomiko told me to save at least 10 minutes for Q&A. And I'd love to take any comments or questions. I'm almost done with this, then I got to cut it and edit it and revise it. But at some point it'll be out. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor Blight, one of our favorite historians, talking about one of our favorite people who could ask for more. My role here is limited, and that is to ensure that the audience has a chance to ask questions of the professor. Why don't I open it up and see who wants to speak to Professor Blight about this inspiring lecture? Yes, Professor Higginbotham.
Oh, thank you. Well, David, as always, you are wonderful. When I think about Douglass, and I'm so glad that you're so interested in the last years of his life, because, you think about a person who's really fought injustice his entire life. What did it feel like then to be an old man and to see what you thought was a certain trajectory of progress turning back?
Yeah.
And because he believed in the law and government and that kind of thing, he was there to see that 1883 civil rights cases. He didn't live for Plessy, but he definitely lived for the 1883 civil rights cases. Yeah. He must have had a certain sense of sadness about what he was seeing. Yeah. In some ways like a moment here where we are and we're saying what's going to happen. Yeah. You see somehow the clock moving back on that civil rights agenda. And that must have weighed on him. Yeah. Did he ever talk about depression or feeling sometimes his soul was weary?
Oh, yeah. It's a great question. He had no question, he had a genuine nervous or emotional breakdown in the early 1850s, early. We know that from Julia Griffiths, many, many, many letters, calling him even suicidal at one point. Because, of course, her letters are almost always part of fundraising from Gerrit Smith, the wealthy abolitionist. She paints Douglass as falling to pieces. Oh, by the way, he needs money. And he did, desperately. But she describes him as paralyzed in his limbs, even unable to get out of bed for 2 days, has a man who comes to wash him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the young Douglass. And that I found, I've always known that, but I didn't know what to do with it until I began to realize, well, this is already the self-made man. The great self-made man speech, which became his most famous speech, not his greatest, although it's not as bad as some people portray it. Anyway, it's not. It's actually an ingenious speech. This is a self-made man who can't provide for his children. It's a self-made man who can't put food on the table. It's a self-made man who doesn't even know what the future is. And he went to pieces. He also, though, in that 2-year frame, 3-year frame of 1851 to 53-4, did the greatest work of his life. His greatest speech, 4th of July, and there's some others there. His greatest short-form editorials about things like the uses of violence now against fugitive slave kidnappers. He wrote The Heroic Slave, his one work of fiction, and he wrote My Bondage and My Freedom at the same time. Later now, it's very difficult to get at the sad Douglass. Of course it's there. God, the mourning that he and Anna went through with one, I mean, I know that children and grandchildren died much more frequently in the 19th century, but and then his son, Fred Jr., dies at age 51. Before he dies, he doesn't say a word about it. It's all kinds of condolence letters. Oh my God, he didn't say a word that I know of. The death of all these grandchildren, some of them in their teenage years, doesn't say anything. Not in the autobiographies and not in much correspondence that has survived. But there are some here or there. When he comes back from Haiti, his experience as U.S. Minister to Haiti, which was a very difficult experience, an interesting but a kind of a debacle in his professional life. And he's having physical problems already. He does complain, I can't walk right anymore, my hand doesn't work when I write. You know, he's probably already got heart disease. He's going to die of, we think, a heart attack in 1895. I just went through heart surgery this summer, and I learned a lot more about heart disease than I ever wanted to know. This guy had heart disease, and he's weakening, and people talk about him that way. And he does talk about how this has been a very difficult year, a tough year, a lot of sadness this year, and so on and so on. And he had enormous disappointments that he went through, that's a mild word, with his sons and his daughter. Oh, God, I won't go into it. But it was very difficult to be his son or daughter, and it was very difficult to see the struggles and frequent failures of particularly his 2 sons, Charles and Frederick Jr. I think there is a very sad, morose Douglass at times. It's just he's never going to tell us that in an autobiographical voice. And 19th century autobiographies weren't about that. And we just don't have enough of his letters to the people he corresponded with who write back constantly, particularly his women friends, are writing to him about how are you feeling? After Anna died. There we do know something. Because when Anna died, he came apart. And there are letters from the daughter and the son saying, Father, and a letter from Martha Green, who lived up here in Rhode Island, Frederick, go to Poland Springs, which is where he went, in Maine, for a month, all by himself, we think. He either stayed with a farmer, or he stayed, there was a newly opened resort hotel. I'm not sure which one he stayed at. But he went and spent a month in Poland Springs all by himself just to deal with it. And so you have to get at it in these episodes where you can find other people saying, and everyone's writing to him, how are you feeling? How are you? How are you? How are you? Would that there'd been that letter where he said, I can't cope, I have fallen apart, I don't want to live. We don't quite have that. So.
One other question, yes.
Jim.
Thank you. David, I hope everybody here knows your book, Race and Reunion, which is one of the great books about the late 19th century. I'm wondering how, between your first book on Douglass and this book, that book intervenes. Does your understanding of the big story you tell in Race and Reunion change as a result of what you've learned about Douglass, especially in the last third of his life? Does it change the argument you made in the first book about the intellectual biography?
Right. Just to clue you in, the first book was my dissertation. It's an intellectual biography of Douglass and the meaning of the Civil War. No, not much changed about that. I thought I could write those chapters on the cheap at one point, thinking, I've already written. No, I hadn't. I mean, that stuff is juvenile writing now to me. His millennial apocalyptic conception of the war, if anything, I make more of it now. I understand it better now, I think. I also know more of these textured details about how he recruited parts of the 54th Regiment, what happened to his sons. I didn't know before this research that his oldest son, Louis, was so badly wounded at Fort Wagner. It really was. He was shot in the groin, as they say. He stayed in a month or so, and then he got gangrene of the scrotum, and he nearly died in a hospital in New York. Douglas spent 2 weeks at his bedside. I didn't know any of that until, digging deeper. With Race and Reunion, no, he's still everywhere talking about memory. I don't use it as a blunt edge in the biography because there's so much more I have to tell. But in fact, I've had to scale it back in a way. There's so many times when he's really talking about memory and the loss of the argument, the narrative, the story. Oh, he uses it all over the 1883 speech after the civil rights cases. This is a failure of memory, is what he calls it. How can the Supreme Court do this? It's 20th anniversary of emancipation, and they're throwing away the 14th Amendment. But no, I haven't changed that argument. There are books that have come out since Race and Reunion that have quarreled with Race and Reunion that have made me think about a lot of things. I mean, there are a couple in particular who well-argued books that have said, maybe I didn't stress enough the theme of Union victory memory, which is another story, but they have a point. But of course, Douglas would fashion these arguments for different audiences. The audience in an AME church, and the audience at a GAR reunion, and the audience here or there. He could fashion arguments. And also, the thing you got to factor in that I didn't when I was working on Douglas the first time is he stumps every year, every election for the Republican candidate. They don't keep him off the trail. They do select somewhat where he goes, but he goes all over New England, and he goes in the Midwest. For some reason, they always sent him to Indiana. Indiana was a swing state, believe it or not, in the 1880s. So he's out there stumping for Blaine and for Garfield and Hayes, Garfield, Blaine, Harrison, and on and on and on. And of course, he also gets appointments from them and gets attacked for that. Oh, does he get attacked in the black press for being this job seeker, which is partly true. But so when he goes on the stump, the Republican Party is the greatest institution in the United States. Emancipation is still alive. You read one of his 1888 campaign speeches, or 92, and you think, Fred, you're missing something here. But it's a campaign. It's a political campaign. So he's employing memory there differently than he might be employing it. In fact, I have these examples. He comes off the campaign trail in one of these election years where he's employing this kind of glorious memory of emancipation, and the Republican Party is the party of freedom. And he's back in Washington at Metropolitan AME Church giving a blistering attack on the federal government and even on the Republican Party. And you think, wait a minute, well, he's a politician as well as an orator.
Thank you so
Long
much
answer
to
to
Professor
that. Sure.
Blight.
Pleasure. Oh my God.
On behalf of the law school, we're presenting you with this
Oh, that
beautifully
cool.
framed portrait of
Whoa.
The poster. Thank you again for this meditation on the life of
I think I got to use that as the title now.
Well, maybe so.
Whoa, that's fantastic. Thank you.